Hi, I'm Scott and welcome back to my shop. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I turned my first bowl. Well, this really isn't my first bowl, but I'm going to turn this one just like I turned my first one. It's a nice simple bowl. It's got a nice foot on the bottom. So if you're interested to see how I made this, just keep watching. To make this simple bowl, I'm going to start out with some kiln-dried 2-inch thick material that I bought at the lumberyard. You can see I have a circle marked on it in pencil. I used a compass. I got the center marked in the piece. To take these corners off, you can either cut them off on a table saw, or you can take it over to a bandsaw and cut them off on a bandsaw. But if you have neither of those, you can turn them away on the lathe, and that's what I'm going to do. So here you can see I have a chuck mounted on the lathe. This is a Nova chuck. It's a fairly inexpensive chuck. And we're going to use a woodworm screw. To mount the woodworm screw in the chuck, we have to open up the jaws. We're going to put the woodworm screw into the chuck and then close the jaws on the screw. Now before you tighten that all the way up, you want to make sure that you pull the screw as far forward as it can go, because you don't want it to slip while you're turning. And then tighten up the jaws. Here you can see I have the woodworm screw mounted in the chuck, and I'm just going to measure how deep a hole I'm going to have to drill for that woodworm screw. And you can see here it's 3/4 of an inch. My woodworm screw requires a 3/8 inch hole drilled. So here's a 3/8 inch bit in my drill, and you can see I used a piece of tape to mark 3/4 of an inch from the tip. Now we're going to drill a hole in the center point that I marked. Now that we have that hole drilled, I can thread this piece of wood onto the woodworm screw. So you can see I just threaded that on until the wood actually makes contact with the top of the jaws. To turn these corners away, I'll be using a 1/2 inch bowl gouge, and it's ground with a swept back grind. You can see I have the tool rest mounted here, so the corners are all clear. I'm going to spin the wood, make sure it clears, and then we're ready to go. You can see I moved the tool rest so it's parallel with the surface of the blank. So I'm going to be leveling off this surface with the bowl gouge, and I'm going to be using this wing and basically doing a pull cut or planing cut. Okay, that didn't take very long, but now we have a nice flat surface. The next step is to create a tenon here, so when we turn the bowl around, the jaws will have something to grip on. You could also create a recess, but I'm going to use a tenon. And my jaws require a 2-inch tenon, and I have these calipers set, or dividers set at 2 inches. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use this point to scribe a line, and I'm going to use this point to compare. This point's never going to touch the wood, it's just going to be used as a visual. Alright, you can see I scribed a line and it's just a little bit big. Alright, so we scribed that second line, and that's perfect. Now that I measured out the size of that tenon, I'm going to use the bowl gouge to actually form and cut that tenon. Alright, so that should be about deep enough. A little bit over 1/8 of an inch. Maybe closer to 1/4. So the next step is to make this tenon the right shape for our jaws. Okay, so this Nova chuck, the standard jaws require a straight tenon. Alright, some chucks require a dovetail tenon, so you're going to have to cut the profile that meets your jaws. To cut the straight shoulder of this tenon, you can use anything that's basically straight. I'm going to use a parting tool. Now that I have that tenon formed, I'll be able to shape the outside of the bowl. And to do that, I'll be using my bowl gouge. I have the tool rest set here at about a 45-degree angle, so I can just work on taking this corner off, and then I'll shape a nice curve into the bowl. Alright, there is using a pull cut. Does an okay job. But I like to use a push cut because I think it leaves a better surface. You can see that push cut really cleaned that surface up quite a bit. With the pull cut, you'll be cutting off of this wing that's closest to the bowl, and you'll be holding the gouge tight to your body and just rocking your body as you pull the gouge across the arc that you want. The push cut, we're going to have the gouge open to about a 45-degree angle, and then we're going to push the tip of the tool and swing the tool through the arc that we want to cut. Okay, let's talk a second about rubbing the bevel. When this wood's turning, you're going to want the bevel of the tool, and that's just from the point out this flat area here. Alright, so I have this heel ground away, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but the flat area here is going to be the bevel, right between the point and the end of the flat area here. So as you're cutting the bowl, you want to ride that bevel across the surface of the wood. Okay, some people will call it riding the bevel, some people will say it's rubbing the bevel, but you want that bevel to stay in contact with the wood as you're cutting through. Okay, so I switched to this overhead shot so you can see that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create an arch from this point over here at the bottom of the bowl to this point over here, which would be the rim of the bowl, and just a nice smooth flowing curve. The more you practice, the easier that'll be. Now that I have the outside of this bowl shaped, it's time to take this off the screw chuck and then turn it around and mount it on the tenon. So I have the spindle lock engaged, and it's time to unscrew the blank from the woodworm screw. I've removed the woodworm screw and opened up the jaws a bit. So now the tenon will fit into the jaws. Alright, and so I'll put pressure on the blank here to push the blank firmly up against the jaws. From this angle, you should be able to see that the blank is firmly up against the jaws, and then just tighten up the jaws to hold the piece on the lathe. There's a couple things you want to look for. You want to make sure that there's no gaps between the top of the jaw and the base of the bowl. And you also want to make sure that the tenon does not sit on the bottom of the jaws, that there actually is some space that you can see right here. If you don't feel you can hold the bowl tight enough against the jaws, you can slide the tailstock in place to put pressure on the bowl as you tighten up the chuck. Now that I have this piece mounted in the chuck, I can flatten this surface. Now that this surface is nice and flat, I'll be able to use the bowl gouge to start hollowing out the bowl. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about rubbing the bevel when we're cutting the inside of the bowl. You can see I have this bowl here and it's all cut away so you can see inside. And here you can see the angle that I have the gouge at with the bevel actually riding against the wood. And as I cut through this bowl, I'm going to rub that bevel and then pivot so that bevel stays in contact all the way through to the center of the bowl. I mentioned earlier I would talk about why I had ground the heel away on my gouge. And the reason I have that ground away is so I can actually make that curve. Okay, so if I didn't have the heel ground away, that heel would actually be digging in as it trailed behind the bevel. And it would leave marks as it rubbed against the wood. So this way, it just makes a nice clean cut, doesn't leave any marks on the wood, and you can cut all the way through to the center. We're going to pick up the cut, create that groove, and then just sweep the gouge through the cut. As you get closer to the edge, you're going to have to decide how thick you want your bowl to be. For smaller bowls, I like to keep them fairly thin, but not so thin that they're too fragile. And you want to make sure that the wall thickness is fairly consistent. So this is still a little bit thick. I'm going to take this down a little bit and then work on the thickness for the bottom. Alright, I can tell just by feeling it here that the bowl's still a little bit thick, down right at this curve, and then through to the bottom. So I'm going to have to take a little bit of this wood out in here. But since this piece was kiln dried, you can pretty much leave it however you want. You know, if you were turning green wood, you'd really want to concentrate on keeping that wall thickness consistent. But with this kiln dried wood, you pretty much can do whatever you want. I'm pretty happy with that thickness, so now it's time to work on this rim. I like to have the rim of my bowl fall slightly into the bowl, so it's going to be taller at the edge than it is on the inside. So I'm just going to take just a little bit off, and that'll help clean up this little groove I got here. I don't know if you could notice or not, but I gave that also just a slight radius. So now that the inside's all hollowed out, it's time to do some sanding. Okay, you can see I have some sandpaper here. I have 120 through 400. And I'm going to work through all the grits on inside and outside. And the outside is best as I can work on because obviously the chuck's going to be in the way. But it's going to be kind of boring, so I'm going to speed this up so you won't have to sit through it. Okay, now that we have that all sanded up, you're probably going to want to raise the grain. It's just an extra step, but what it's going to do is it's going to lift up any grain that got folded down while we were sanding. And I'm just going to spray some water on to do that. And once this bowl dries, the surface will be a little bit fuzzy where the grain was raised. So we'll be able to sand all that away with the last grit that we used, which was 400. Now that the piece is dry, you can feel it's like a little fuzzy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some 400 grit and I'm just going to lightly sand that fuzziness away. Okay, that feels all nice and polished up now. Okay, so now it's time to turn the tenon away on the bottom of the bowl. So I have here just a piece of scrap wood mounted in the chuck, and you can see that I've trued it up, and there's just a slight depression in the face of it, and I'm going to cover that with some shelf liner material and then put the bowl on it. And there's a little dimple here you can see in the bottom of the bowl, and when I bring that live center up, the point of the live center will just go in that little dimple, and that should make the whole thing run true. Yeah, that's running fairly true. With the bowl now mounted on the lathe and it being held here by the live center on the tailstock, I'll be able to take this tenon away, use part of it to form a foot, and then blend in anything else that I hadn't sanded down previous. The first thing I'm going to do is, you can see where the jaws were pinching onto the wood. I'm going to true that up so it's nice and round. Okay, you can see on the tenon here that all those marks are gone. And so the next step will be to blend this into the curve of the piece, so we have a nice smooth curve from the foot up the sides. To blend that in, I'm going to use a shear scraping cut, and you can see I have the tool basically at about a 45-degree angle to the floor, and I'm just going to be using this wing as a scraper, and I should just be able to slice this wood real clean and blend this in. Okay, that blended in real nice. The next step would be to adjust the height of this tenon so I can use it as a foot. And for this size bowl, I'm going to want the foot to be fairly small. Alright, now that I have this tenon all removed down, I'm going to switch to a spindle gouge. And it's just for the angle. Alright, this has quite a different grind angle on it. This is maybe about a 35-degree angle, where the bowl gouge was probably closer to 60. And you can see the difference here. With this 60-degree angle, I'm really not going to be able to get in and take much of this wood away. But with this gouge, because of the angle, I can get into this corner a lot easier. Alright, you can see here that I kind of made this concave. But what I really don't want is, I don't want this wood to basically come up to this foot. I want that to be distinct. And that's really personal choice, so you could pretty much do it however you want. But I have a way of using my small skew to come in here and really define that foot. So here you can see I have my small skew, and you can see how I'm going to be able to use the heel of that to really define the foot on this piece. Okay, so the goal here is really to get the bottom of here to line up with the inside of this foot, and I think I can go just a hair deeper. Alright, so now that we have this all cleaned up, it's really time to sand up this area here. So I'll turn the lathe speed down to about 800-ish, and I'm just going to sand this part, and sand inside here, and then we'll worry about taking off that little nub. To get rid of this nub, it can be done a whole lot of different ways. It can be done using some cold jaws that you would just put on your chuck. I have a Longworth chuck, which is very similar to the cold jaws, and it will grab the outside of the bowl so you can, and hold it so you can just work on the bottom. But if I didn't have that, how would I get rid of the nub? You could sand it away. You could use a chisel, and that's what I used to do until I got a hook knife. So now I use a hook knife to take the little nub away. And you can see that hook knife, it pretty much did a good job getting rid of that nub. And all that would be left was to take some sandpaper and just sand that smooth. So I took a few minutes off camera to sand up the bottom, but you can see that came out really nice. I even managed to sand out the little nick I put in the foot. And so now it's time to cover the piece with your favorite finish. And for me, that's going to be some walnut oil. Okay, well there you have it. A nice simple bowl made out of some 2-inch thick kiln dried maple that I picked up at the hardwood dealer. Right? So it's got a nice shape. It's got a nice little foot on the bottom. Okay, even wall thickness. And so there you go, a nice simple bowl. So I hope you liked the video. If you did, please hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel. And just remember, if I can do this in my shop, I'm sure you can do it in yours. And I'll see you next time in Scott's Mini Woodshop. Have a great day.